No one expected that a nurse who had worked for many years in a hospice, a place where those with no remaining options spend their final days on earth, would make such a startling declaration that would stir up public opinion. She said the following: "Even in our advanced world, the idea of what lies beyond death is still often avoided. I want to share the remarkable things I have witnessed myself. I do this so that those who have lost dear family or close friends can know that they have not ceased to be, but continue on in the spiritual dimension. In my professional capacity, I have been present for countless passings and have had the chance to observe what genuinely unfolds for a person in the final instance of life. I can say with full honesty that in these deeply mysterious moments, a kind of curtain is drawn back before the dying, revealing a view into the other side, separating it from our world, and they see what we, the living, cannot access. Moreover, what they see often brings them peace. Some people believe in life beyond death and others do not. As for me, I no longer ask that question, because I don't need to believe. I know for certain that life goes on after death." The nurse who made this statement is named Julie McFadden. While working in the intensive care unit at a hospice, she encountered many unusual situations. She openly admitted to witnessing supernatural experiences related to the death process many times. One of the most striking and unforgettable events involved a patient who was under 30 years old, but had been diagnosed with a terminal condition. He spent the last half year of his existence in the hospice. This patient struggled greatly with the idea of letting go of the achievements and comforts he had gained through his hard work. At the hospice, few friends came to visit him, and his relatives appeared even less frequently. Sensing his deep loneliness, Julie McFadden would often sit and talk with him, and before long he began to regard her as a trusted friend. He confided in her the thoughts that troubled him most, above all, his terror of dying. He often asked her what exactly happens to the dying and what truly awaits beyond. On the day this man passed, Julie was not at the hospice. She had gone out to take care of personal matters, but an odd sense of unease gripped her while driving. A strong intuition struck her heart, making her think of that young man, and just then she thought she heard his voice say, "Oh, if I had only known that death is like this, I wouldn't have feared its arrival." Julie looked around, confirming she was alone in the car, and right then her phone rang. The on-duty nurse informed her that the young man had passed away. Julie then realized that as he departed from our world, this young man had sent her a final message of thanks for her kindness and care. Deeply moved by this experience, Julie didn't speak about it for many years, fearing she'd be labeled delusional and risk her professional career. But that message from beyond didn't just convince her of the afterlife. It inspired her to pay much closer attention to the dying process, to better understand what occurs when someone exits the physical world. Through her work, Julie discovered patterns that indicated when someone was near death. All of these were intimately tied to the moment a person crosses over. She referred to these signs as deathbed phenomena. People nearing death often become deeply emotional and wish for their loved ones to be present. She also noticed that dogs are particularly sensitive to an impending death. When their human is close to passing, they grow restless and remain by their side, providing comfort without leaving them for even a moment. Julie described other signs too, ones that led her to believe firmly in a life beyond. Thanks to these signs, she became certain that a beautiful existence awaits beyond our material world. She now believes that death is more like waking up in a place that we've always known but somehow forgotten. In the final days of life, people tend to behave in similar ways and express familiar words. According to Julie's notes, just before death, people enter a period of intense clarity. They begin to see and feel everything with striking sharpness and experience a sudden rise in vitality, even those who are gravely ill. She said, "Extraordinary things happen before many people die. Their appetite returns, some get out of bed, start walking, speaking, even laughing. Sadly, this burst of energy is short-lived. Many patients pass away within hours or a few days after this. That's why Julie tries to prepare families ahead of time, so the death of a loved one following a few good days doesn't completely shatter them. However, one night, she suddenly calmed down. When I asked her what had changed, she looked at me and said quietly, "My father came to me. He was standing by my bed and told me not to be scared. He said he'd be with me and would walk with me through everything." After that night, her fear disappeared. She seemed much more at peace and passed away with a serene expression on her face. Barbara noticed that such peaceful transitions happened more often when the dying person had unresolved emotional issues addressed in some way. She observed that those who made peace with themselves or with others, even if only in their hearts, often left more gently. "I've seen people hold on for days, even weeks, just to say one last important thing or hear something meaningful from someone they love," Barbara noted. Another striking detail she described was the presence of light. In several cases, she and other staff members noticed that the room would seem brighter at the moment of a patient's death. Sometimes it was described as a soft glow, other times a sudden flash. No artificial source of this light could be found. These occurrences happened without explanation, but they were always followed by a sense of calm and stillness that filled the room. Barbara concluded that there is far more to dying than we understand. "What I've seen doesn't make me afraid," she said. "It makes me curious. There's something beautiful and unexplainable about the way people go. It feels like they're being carried somewhere we just can't see." Another nurse, Susan Hale, spoke about her own experiences in the hospice. She had worked for over 15 years and encountered dozens of patients who claimed to have seen loved ones waiting for them. One elderly man who had lost his wife 10 years earlier began speaking to her a few days before his death. Susan initially thought he was confused, but then he looked right at her and said, "Don't worry, Susan. Mary is here. She's been waiting for me." That night, he passed peacefully in his sleep. Susan emphasized that she was a rational person. She had never believed in ghosts or spiritual beings before she started working in hospice care. But after years of first-hand experiences, her perspective shifted. "You can't see what we see day after day and not start to think there's something else out there," she said. These testimonies, shared by professionals who work closely with the dying, have one common thread: a recurring sense of peace, presence, and transition. Whether it's the comforting arrival of a loved one, a moment of unexpected energy, or a bright light no one can explain, something happens at the moment of death that goes beyond our understanding. As more testimonies like these were collected, a broader picture began to emerge. The idea that death is not just a biological process, but a deeply emotional and spiritual experience began to take hold. It was as if each person's journey towards death was uniquely shaped by their personal beliefs, relationships, and unresolved emotions. The presence of family members, whether physical or spiritual, seemed to have a powerful impact on the quality of a person's final days. One of the most profound cases Susan recalled was a woman named Grace, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Grace was a devout woman, deeply committed to her faith, but her final days were clouded by guilt over a conflict she had with her daughter years earlier. Despite their attempts at reconciliation, Grace had trouble letting go of the pain. In the last week of her life, however, something unexpected happened. According to Susan, Grace began to speak to someone no one else could see. At first, it was unclear who she was talking to, but Susan noticed Grace's expression softening, her words more tender. "I can't believe you're here," Grace would say. "I thought you'd never forgive me." After a while, it became apparent that Grace was conversing with her late mother, who had passed away when Grace was a young woman. The conversations were not so much about unresolved issues, but about reconnection and comfort. By the end of the week, Grace's fears seemed to lift. The guilt that had plagued her for so long was replaced with a sense of peace. She passed away quietly, in her sleep, with a small smile on her face. Stories like Grace's began to indicate that there might be a healing process that occurs at the end of life, something that transcends the physical body and touches on the emotional and spiritual parts of a person. In some cases, this was reflected in patients' dreams, where loved ones appeared and spoke with them, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply providing reassurance. Several hospice workers also mentioned a curious phenomenon: the sensation that a patient's spirit or soul seemed to linger after their death. This wasn't always visible to the human eye, but the sense of presence was palpable. Nurses reported that in the moments after death, some patients' rooms felt unusually full. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that suggested a lingering connection. One nurse described it as if the room held its breath for a moment, waiting for something to settle before the space felt empty again. Interestingly, this sense of lingering presence wasn't always tied to a traumatic or sudden death. In fact, the most common experiences occurred when patients had had a long period of illness or struggle, and their family members had been able to say their goodbyes. The peacefulness of their passing, the sense that they were being watched over, or that they had been prepared for this final step in some intangible way, seemed to reinforce the belief that death is not a solitary experience, but rather one shared with those we love, both those we can see and those we cannot. These observations brought hospice workers to a profound conclusion. Death, while a finality in many respects, could also be a form of transition, a passage from one form of existence to another. It wasn't so much that the body ceased to exist, but rather that the person's journey continued in a different way, beyond the physical realm. In a sense, many began to view their work not just as providing care for the body, but as being companions on a sacred journey. Hospice workers were often the quiet witnesses to a deeply personal and transformative experience. They found themselves not just alleviating pain, but also offering emotional and spiritual support to those at the threshold of death. Many spoke about the privilege of being present during these intimate moments, even if they didn't fully understand the mysteries unfolding before them. As hospice workers began to share more stories with each other, they noticed that these experiences of connection and transition were not just reserved for the dying, but for the families and loved ones surrounding them as well. It became evident that death affected not just the person who was passing, but also the network of people who loved and cared for them. One particular story stood out to Susan, a hospice worker who had been with the organization for many years. It involved a man named Harold, a quiet and reserved man in his late 70s who had been battling a long-term illness. His daughter, Lisa, was devoted to him, visiting daily to offer comfort and care. However, it wasn't until the final few days of his life that the depth of their emotional bond truly became apparent. Harold had always been a man of few words, and in his final days, he had become even more withdrawn, unable to speak much at all. His daughter, Lisa, spent hours sitting by his bedside, quietly reading to him or holding his hand, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear or understand her. On the evening before Harold passed, something remarkable happened. Lisa had stepped out for a brief moment to grab a cup of coffee, and when she returned, she was shocked to find her father in a completely different state. Harold, who had been silent and unresponsive for so long, was now sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, as though he was looking at someone or something just beyond her. His face was filled with a peaceful, serene expression, and he seemed to be speaking, though no words could be heard. Lisa stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, but before she could speak, Harold reached out with his hand. As if guided by some unseen force, he reached past Lisa's hand and held the air, his fingers outstretched. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment ended, and Harold's body relaxed once again. He returned to his previous position, his breathing shallow. The nurse who had been with them at the time later explained that many families reported similar experiences in the days before a loved one's death. It wasn't unusual for patients to appear to see things that others could not. Sometimes they reached out as if grasping something unseen, or smiled at a presence only they could perceive. It was as though they were preparing for something beyond the veil of life, and these interactions, though mysterious, provided comfort to those who were left behind. Lisa was understandably shaken, but after a few moments, she found herself feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. It was as if her father had been telling her in his own way that he was ready to let go, and that there was something beyond this life waiting for him. It was a moment of connection that transcended words and explained so much of what she had felt in the years of caring for him. Harold passed away peacefully later that night, and his family found comfort in the knowledge that his last moments had been filled with calm, a sense of readiness, and perhaps even a reunion with someone they could not see. Lisa spoke to Susan later, sharing how the experience changed her understanding of death. She had always feared it, as many people do, but now she saw it not as an end, but as part of a larger, more mysterious cycle. The idea that death might be a passage, a transformation, rather than an end, began to spread more widely among hospice workers and the families they cared for. Many patients in the final stages of life seemed to demonstrate a kind of awareness, a sense of knowing that their time was drawing to a close, and in some cases the ability to speak to loved ones who had already passed. These instances weren't isolated. There were patterns emerging, suggesting that death was not as unknown as society often portrays it. There was something beyond it, some kind of continuity that was hinted at through these last, precious moments of life. These experiences were particularly meaningful for the families, who found themselves grappling with the idea of what happens after death. The comfort and peace that these encounters brought were not just for the person who was passing, but for everyone involved. It was a gift, a reminder that no one truly dies alone. In response to these experiences, many hospice workers began incorporating spiritual care as part of their services. They recognized that while they could offer medical support, physical care, and comfort, there was something else at play, something that needed to be addressed. Spiritual care, whether through prayer, meditation, or simply providing a comforting presence, became as important as the medical care they provided. For many patients, it was the emotional and spiritual support that allowed them to transition more peacefully. Susan reflected on how her own understanding of death had evolved over the years. She had started her career as a nurse with a deeply scientific perspective on life and death. But after all the stories she had heard and witnessed, she had come to believe in something more. The experience of being with a person as they passed, seeing their last moments of clarity, or hearing them speak to those who had gone before, was something that could not easily be explained by science alone. In her heart, Susan knew there was a spiritual aspect to death. It wasn't just a physical process, but a profound emotional and spiritual experience that affected not only the person who was dying, but those who remained. The transition was something much larger, an experience that intertwined the threads of life, love, and loss. As the years went by, the hospice community grew more attuned to the complexity of end-of-life experiences. The awareness of the spiritual dimensions of death became more integrated into care practices, and the stories of extraordinary moments continued to accumulate. Patients who had once been thought of as unresponsive or incommunicative began to show subtle signs of engagement in ways that defied traditional understanding. Their families, in turn, found themselves reassured by these unexplainable occurrences, seeing them not as a source of fear, but as a sign that their loved ones were not alone in their final moments. One such experience was shared by a nurse named Rachel, who had been working with a patient named George, a retired school teacher in his 80s who had been battling cancer for several months. George had always been a quiet and deeply introspective man, rarely speaking about his past, his family, or anything of his emotional world. In the months leading up to his death, he became increasingly withdrawn, barely able to converse with his caregivers or family. One afternoon, as Rachel sat by his bedside, she noticed that George seemed to be staring at something beyond her, his eyes fixed on an empty corner of the room. She had grown used to these moments, where patients seemed to look at something others couldn't see. But this time George's gaze was intense, and his face carried a look of recognition, as though he was waiting for something. Rachel stayed quiet, watching him. After several minutes, George finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "She's here," he said, his voice filled with wonder and a sense of peace. Rachel, confused but not wanting to interrupt, asked gently, "Who is here, George?" He smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the corner of the room. "My sister," he replied. "She passed many years ago. I've been waiting for her." In that moment, Rachel was struck by the calmness in his voice, and she knew that George was not hallucinating or confused. There was something else happening. A reunion, perhaps, or a sense of closure. Later that night, as Rachel was leaving her shift, she learned from George's daughter, Helen, that George had a sister named Mary who had passed away suddenly in a car accident many years earlier. George had never fully recovered from her loss, and Helen had often spoken of how his grief had remained with him throughout his life, though he never spoke about it directly. The next day, George passed peacefully in his sleep, and his family found solace in the belief that he had been reunited with his sister before his departure. For Rachel, it reinforced the notion that there was something beyond the physical realm, something that could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Over time, more patients began to share similar experiences. They would describe seeing loved ones or figures they did not recognize, sometimes speaking to them or reaching out toward them, as if preparing to go with them. These stories were not just comforting to the families, but also provided a sense of continuity and peace. Many families, despite their grief, felt reassured that their loved one's journey did not end with their final breath, but instead continued on in some way, with a welcoming presence awaiting them. As the hospice workers reflected on these experiences, it became evident that their role was more than just providing medical care. They were also providing a sacred space for these transitions. Their work was not only about helping people die with dignity and comfort, but about honoring the spiritual and emotional journeys that unfolded in the final moments of life. They had come to understand that death was not simply an event, but a process that involved the heart, the mind, and the spirit. One evening, Susan sat down with a group of fellow hospice workers to discuss the many stories they had heard from families. They had begun to share these experiences openly, finding comfort in the shared understanding that there was something more to death than they had originally thought. As they spoke, Susan reflected on how far their understanding of death had evolved since she first started working in hospice care. She thought back to the early days when death was something that could be controlled, something to be feared and avoided at all costs. Over the years, she had learned that while death was inevitable, it was also a deeply personal and spiritual journey. It was an experience that could be full of grace, mystery, and even beauty, if approached with the right mindset. The stories that had emerged from their work had shaped her beliefs in profound ways. She no longer saw death as an end, but as a passage, a transition into something greater, something beyond human understanding. And as she shared these stories with her colleagues, she saw the same transformation happening in them. They were no longer just caretakers of the body. They were also caretakers of the soul, offering not just physical comfort, but emotional and spiritual support to the people they served. The idea that death was not an end, but a continuation of a journey, gave many patients the peace they needed to pass on with dignity. For the families, it was a profound comfort. It allowed them to release their loved ones without the burden of fear, knowing that their loved ones were not alone in those final moments, and that whatever lay ahead was something beyond their comprehension, but not beyond their connection. As Susan continued her work, she found that she no longer dreaded the word goodbye. Instead, she had come to embrace it, knowing that in each goodbye, there was always the promise of something more, something that transcended the boundaries of this world. As we reflect on the stories shared and the experiences we've explored, we invite you to engage with us. What are your thoughts on the spiritual dimensions of death? Have you encountered moments or stories that offer comfort or new perspectives on the journey of life and death? Feel free to share your experiences, questions, or insights in the comments below. Let's open a conversation about these meaningful and often mysterious moments that connect us all, and explore the ways in which we can find peace and understanding in the face of life's greatest transition. We look forward to hearing from you.